حضرها فخامة رئيس جمهورية أرض الصومال حامد.
رئيس جمهورية أرض الصومال السيد عبد الرحمن محمد عبد الله عرو، أهلا بك.
Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive with us. Today we're looking at this piece from the Somaliland Chronicle. It's called
diblomaasiyadda qarsoon maaha diblomaasiyad anigu aan keenay maaha waa magacyada diblomaasiyaddu ay leedahay abcaash.
Assalaamu calaykum waraxmatullah wabarakaat dhammaan ummadda islaamka meel kastay joogaan aad baa idin salaamaya waayo waa walaalkiin Jamaal channelkaygu hadduna subscribe ku hayn subscribe like tanada lagugu leeyahay like share comment intaba waa dhankiina naga tiiriya idinka ayaan wax idin soo galinaynaa idinkuna like ta naga dhisa Allah ha idin sharfee nagu sharfa like ta iyo subscribe taba aad maanta waxaan idin hayaa waad ogeydeen Madaxweyne Abdiraxmaan Ciro inuu tagay dalka Imaaraadka oo ka qayb galay shirweynihii adduunka aad kulli shirkii markuu dhamaaday kadib dawlado badan oo Afrika kamid ah ayaa ku baraarugay arrankii Somaliland waayaa dad badan iyo wadano badan ayaa dib ula shiray Madaxweyne Abdiraxmaan Ciro waa cajaayib dad badan oo falanqeynaya oo hadda ku baraarugay arrinka ayaan idin hayaa maanta fiidiyo aad u qurux badan ayaan idin hayaa soo dhawaada ila soo daawo.
حضرها فخامة رئيس جمهورية أرض الصومال حامد، كيف هي الأجواء فيما حولك في اليوم الأول واللحظة الأولى التي تنطلق فيها القمة العالمية للحكومات التي تستشرف المستقبل؟
نعم، صبحك الله بالخير سهيل وجميع مشاهدينا عبر قنوات أبو ظبي للإعلام ومن دانة الدنيا دبي. تنطلق اليوم فعاليات هذه الدورة الاستثنائية واستشراف حكومات المستقبل من القمة العالمية للحكومات التي تنطلق اليوم حتى 13 من هذا الشهر هنا في دبي. يجتمع العالم أجمع هنا لاستشراف المستقبل، تحولات تاريخية متسارعة وجذرية وإيجاد الحلول وكذلك استشراف المستقبل من السمة الكبرى لهذا المنتدى العالمي الذي يشارك فيه ويحضره أكثر من 6000 مشارك، أكثر من 30 رئيس دولة وحكومة، 400 وزير، كذلك 30 اجتماع وزاري، أكثر من كذلك 140 حكومة تجتمع تحت سقف واحد هنا في دبي وفي هذا المكان، بالإضافة إلى أكثر من 21 منتدى عالمي في هذه القمة.
adduunka meel kastoo laga joogo hadda waxa lagu og yahay dawlad Somaliland la yiraahdo inay Afrika ku taalo. cajaayib alcajaayibaad adduunkii oo dhan waxay eegayaan hadda dawladan sidan u quruxda badan leh sidan isku maamushay iyadu iskeedu taagan halkay ku qarsoonayd wal cajaayib alcajaayibaad weeyaan oo waxyaabaha u cajabay nafluhu ay dadku leeyihiin. Somaliland way guuleysatay aad ila si daawo wali adiga yaabi doonee.
رئيس جمهورية أرض الصومال السيد عبد الرحمن محمد عبد الله عرو، أهلا بك فخامة الرئيس معنا على سكاي نيوز عربية الآن من القمة العالمية للحكومات.
شكرا جزيلا لاستضافتي في سكاي نيوز، وهذه فرصة طيبة تتيح لي أن أتحدث إليكم وإلى جمهوركم الكريم. وفي البداية أود أن أخبركم وأخبر جمهوركم الكريم أنني من صومالي لاند، وهي منطقة استقلت عن بريطانيا في العام 1968 ثم انضمت إلى الصومال بشكل طوعي في بعد استقلالها ب5 أيام، ثم اندلعت الحرب الأهلية، وبسبب هذه الحرب الأهلية سعينا لاستعادة استقلالنا في العام 1991. فنحن منذ العام 1991 فنحن بلد مستقر متطور نعيش نعيش في سلام وديمقراطية ونعقد انتخابات ديمقراطية وتنتقل السلطة في بلدنا انتقالا سلميا وفقا لميراثنا.
diblomaasiyadda qarsoon maaha diblomaasiyad anigu aan keenay maaha waa magacyada diblomaasiyaddu ay leedahay afcaasha diblomaasiyadda ee weyn adduunyada ka jirta ayay tahay mid ka mid ah marka wadamo badan baa ku dhaqma xilliyo badan baana lagu dhaqmaa madaxweynaha jamhuuriyadda Somaliland mudane Cabdiraxmaan Maxamed Cabdilaahi wuxuu u safray dalka Imaaraadka Carabta safarkiisii ugu horeeyay dabeetana safar wuxuu ahaa uu tegay madaxweynuhu baxay dadkiisa si wanaagsan bay u ogaayeen markuu baxayay markuu imanayay si wanaagsan bay u ogaayeen laakiin intii uu ku sugnaa Imaaraadka Carabta ee uu madaxda ugu waaweyn Imaaraadka Carabta la kulmayay wax badan oo sawira lama soo bandhigin oo laga qaaday iyadoo hadda shaqo weyn oo ballaarin socotay oo kamidaba laga yaabay in shaqooyinka ugu waaweynaa aynu qabanay ay kamid tahay laakiin lama soo bandhigin laakiin haddaynu aragnaa Soomaaliya natiijadii inay dawladda Imaaraadku markii ugu horeysay shir awal badhici jiray oo aan weligeed dhicin oo platformkii afraad adduunyada kii ugu weynaa ah in laynagu soo casuumo oo soddon madaxweyne la dhex fadhiisiyo oo front benchka seating arrangementka front benchka lasoo fadhiisiyo oo hadal la siiyo oo adduunyadii uu la hadlo oo Somaliland ahmiyadday leedahay dhaqaale ahmiyadda amniyay leedahay dimuqraadiyadda ay gaadhay horumarka ay wado dawlad wanaagga ay wado oo adduunyada meel platform 6,000 oo qof isugu yimaadeen 140 shirkadood oo waaweyn iyo adduunyadii isugu timid in ka badan 400 oo wasiir isugu yimaadeen iyo 30 hogaamiyaha adduunyada oo madaxweyne iyo ra'iisul wasaaraha wax weyn bay noqotay marka siyaasadda qarsoon hadda laga yaabaa in dadkeenu bilaabayaan marka meelaha ay ku habboon tahay oo kale waxa weeye inaynu iska qaar marka waa sida hore kuugu sheegay madaxweynaha hadda inuu hogaaminayo diblomaasi marka taas laga yaabaa inay nagu cusub tahay
ummadda Soomaaliyeed waxaan ugu baaqaynaa guusha Somaliland gaadhay waa guul Soomaali oo dhan ku faani karto dawladnimada Somaliland idin didinin waa dawlad Soomaaliyeed waa ummad Soomaaliyaanu nahay magaca Soomaaliyeed markuu caalamka ku dhinto meesha kaliya la soo qabanayo la kuwanba waa Soomaali miidana kii ayaanu haynin magaca xitaa badbaadinayn marka Soomaali qarax iyo qax iyo dhac iyo budcadbadeed iyo balaayo dhan lagu suntay cid kaliya magaca wax ka badbaadinaysa la kuwaniba waa Soomaali sidan isu doorta kuwaniba waa Soomaali deganaanshahan leh kuwaniba waa Soomaali nabadgelyadan haysta dadkii la lahaabanu nahayo intii magac inaga dhaxeeyay xaq iyaga waan ka badbaadinayn marka dawladnimada aanu helaana inay wax idin tartan mooyaane balaayo idin noqon mayso idin shidayn mayso taas ku bishaaraysta idin leenahay waxa kale oo doonaynaa inaydaan saska qaadin guushan gaadhin inaydaan cadaawad noo qaadin inaydaan nagu beerin waxaan maanta nagu jirin yaan ummadda Soomaaliyeed kala ka codsan khaasatan waliba dawladda Soomaaliya xamarka talinaysa dawladda Soomaaliyeed cidun baa matalayda maanta shirka dunida isugu timid dawladda Somaliland baa ummadda Soomaaliyeed oo dhan matashay oo magaca Somaliland ku matashay oo dawladda Somaliland ku matashay.
Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive with us. Today we're looking at this piece from the Somaliland Chronicle. It's called Somaliland, Trump's Realist Foreign Policy in Action.
Interesting title, right?
Yeah.
And the author is Abdirahman Mohammed Abdi Daud.
So the big argument here is that potential U.S. recognition of Somaliland's independence would be like a prime example of a realist foreign policy approach.
Right.
And one that could benefit both countries.
Exactly.
Before we get ahead of ourselves, though, can we maybe break down what this shift from liberalism to realism actually means?
Sure.
Like, I feel like those terms get thrown around a lot.
Yeah.
But I'm not always sure I fully grasp them.
Totally fair. It can feel like wading through a lot of jargon sometimes.
Yeah, so let's break those down.
Yeah.
When we talk about liberalism in international relations, we're not talking about like left-wing politics, right?
Yeah.
It's something different.
Yeah, it's a little different. In this context, liberalism is more about the idea that countries can cooperate and work within international institutions like the UN. And it's the idea that, you know, spreading democracy around the world is going to lead to a more peaceful and stable global order.
But theoretically, Somaliland should be like the poster child for all of these liberal ideals. They've built a relatively stable and democratic system in a very tough neighborhood. But it doesn't seem like that's been enough to get them a seat at the table. Why not?
Well, that's where I think the sources we have today get really interesting. One argument that they make is that this strict adherence to a centralized international system like we have now with the UN at the top is actually hurting Somaliland. because they're not recognized. They can't access those institutions. They can't get the benefits of being a part of the club.
So it's like a catch-22. You need to be recognized to get the support you need to thrive, but you can't get recognized because you're struggling to thrive.
Exactly. It's a real dilemma.
Yeah.
And then there's another layer to all of this. Remember all that international aid that has been poured into Somaliland's neighbor?
Yeah. Billions and billions of dollars, right? And all with the goal of promoting development and democracy.
Exactly. And our source today actually makes the point, has that aid really been effective? I mean, Somalia is still incredibly unstable, and there's even some evidence to suggest that this aid might actually be undermining some of the progress that Somaliland has made on its own.
It's a pretty serious accusation. Are there any specific examples that they give?
Yeah, they actually point to a specific instance from the early 1990s where UN agencies essentially undermined Somaliland's own democratic processes. It's a really stark reminder that even these well-intentioned interventions can sometimes backfire.
So Somaliland isn't just being ignored. It's actually being actively harmed by the very system that's supposed to be helping.
That's the disturbing implication here. And it really leads us to ask, is there a better way to approach these really complex situations? Is the current model of international relations actually serving everyone?
Okay, so we've talked about some of the limits of liberalism. Where does realism fit into all this?
Well, realism kind of takes a different approach. It emphasizes national self-interest, the pursuit of power, and it's based on this idea that the world is fundamentally an anarchic place where every state has to look out for itself.
So less about kumbaya and more about competition.
Exactly. More about competition and self-preservation. And the sources we have today, they actually argue that recognizing Somaliland would be a very realist move, especially for the U.S.
Okay, that's a twist. How so?
Well, think about China's growing influence in the region. China has been investing heavily in Africa, securing access to resources and strategic locations. And Somaliland has a very valuable piece of real estate, the port of Berbera.
Right. I see where you're going with this.
Right.
Recognizing Somaliland and partnering with them would give the U.S. a foothold in that region, counter China's influence.
Exactly. Secure your own interests, even if it means going against, the established norms.
Interesting. And this realist perspective kind of helps us understand how other players in the region are acting too, right?
Absolutely. I mean, take Turkey, for instance.
Yeah.
They've been increasing their presence in Somalia, but our sources today, they argue that this isn't just out of, altruism. They're also pursuing their own economic and strategic goals, especially access to resources.
So it's like this big game of chess with Somaliland stuck in the middle.
Yeah.
You mentioned that one of the sources argues that maybe it's not liberalism itself that's the problem, but how it's being put into practice.
Right. Sometimes sticking too rigidly to those international systems ignores what's actually happening on the ground, especially in a place like Somaliland.
It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Exactly. It just doesn't work.
So instead of throwing out liberalism completely, the idea is to be a little bit more pragmatic, right? Like to see those limitations and change our approach based on what's actually going on in each situation.
Yeah, exactly. Be more flexible and less dogmatic, I think is a good way to put it.
Okay, so if we can't just blindly apply these liberal principles, what would a more realistic and maybe effective way to approach this situation with Somaliland look like? What are we even trying to achieve here?
Well, I think a good place to start is to just acknowledge that Somaliland is a unique case. It's not just a breakaway region or a problem that needs to be solved. It has its own history, its own culture, and a political system that's been functioning for over 3 decades.
And in that time, they've actually made some real progress in terms of building a pretty stable and democratic society, especially considering the region they're in, which has been, kind of a hotbed of conflict.
Absolutely. And I think a realistic approach would recognize those achievements and engage with Somaliland on its own terms.
Yeah.
Not just viewing it through the lens of Somalia or through some idea of what we think a state should be.
So meet them where they are. Recognize what they've already accomplished.
Yeah.
Speaking of interconnectedness, when we were talking about aid to Somalia earlier, one of the sources made a pretty strong claim. They said that the current approach has actually led to some pretty serious policy failures.
Yeah, they specifically mentioned the continuing presence of al-Shabaab in Somalia. Despite billions of dollars in aid and military interventions, a lot of southern Somalia is still controlled by this terrorist group.
And they also pointed to the fact that Somalia's scores for governance and corruption have actually been declining as more evidence that things aren't really working.
Right. It just shows that even with the best intentions, throwing money at a problem doesn't necessarily solve it. Sometimes those interventions can actually make things worse if they don't consider what's already happening on the ground. They argue that sticking with this fragile relationship with a government that hasn't really shown a strong commitment to stability or democratic values might not be the best move for the U.S., especially when there's a chance for a stronger, more aligned partnership with Somaliland.
It's like choosing your battles, right?
Yeah, exactly. The sources even go so far as to say that recognizing Somaliland could be the wake-up call Somalia needs to actually get its act together.
Okay, now I'm really interested. How would recognizing Somaliland lead to positive changes in Somalia? It seems kind of counterintuitive.
Well, the thinking is that Somalia has become too reliant on international aid and intervention. Like, there's this assumption that the international community will always be there to bail them out, no matter how dysfunctional things get. By recognizing Somaliland, the sources argue, you take away that crutch and force Somalia to deal with its own internal problems head on.
So a little tough love, make them sink or swim.
Something like that. The idea is that this could be the shock to the system that finally pushes Somalia towards more self-reliance and accountability. Of course, there's no guarantee it'll work. It's a gamble.
It's definitely a bold move. A lot riding on whether Somalia can step up. But let's zoom out for a second and address another criticism that comes up a lot. The idea that the U.S. should just stay out of this entirely. Let the African nations figure it out themselves.
Yeah, you hear that a lot in international affairs. Let them handle their own problems. But the sources make a pretty strong argument against that approach. They talk about the current system of state recognition, where the African Union basically has a veto over any new state joining the international community.
So even if Somaliland has a good case, the African Union could just shut it down. Seems like that gives the AU a lot of power.
Exactly. And the sources argue that this deference to the AU has actually slowed things down and allowed other players, especially China, to take advantage. They suggest that by waiting for the AAU to act, the U.S. is losing ground to a rival that might not have the same goals.
It seems like there's been a lot of support building up for Somaliland's independence, for years.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. What's really interesting is that this isn't some spur of the moment thing. This is a really carefully planned out strategy we're seeing play out. So there have been multiple bills in Congress, actually pushing for Somaliland to be recognized. And then Senator James Risch even managed to slip a Somaliland Partnership Act into the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act. Oh, yeah. It's a huge deal. It's actually the very first time that Somaliland's been formally recognized in U.S. law. So it's a pretty big signal that American foreign policy might be kind of shifting. And even before all that, former Assistant Secretary of State Jen Fraser was trying to work things out diplomatically, but, she ran into some roadblocks with the African Union.
So we've got lawmakers and diplomats all pushing for Somaliland. This isn't just some random idea floating around, right? There's some serious strategy going on here. So, one of his core arguments, and, I think this is a good place to start, is that recognizing a state is ultimately a sovereign right. It's not something that's just dictated by international institutions like the African Union.
Right.
And so he actually thinks the U.S. is in a really unique position to lead the way in recognizing Somaliland, even if it means kind of going against what the AU wants.
Interesting. So why the U.S.?
So he looks at some historical examples. One of the ones that he brings up is the Baltic states.
Okay.
And, they were forcibly incorporated into the Soviet Union back in the day, but the U.S. never recognized that.
Right.
They kind of held firm and said, no, these are independent countries, and eventually they were able to regain their independence. And so he kind of sees a little bit of a parallel there with Somaliland. He's arguing that Somaliland was never truly a part of Somalia in a way that was legitimate or fully consensual. And that's where he thinks the U.S. has kind of a moral and historical obligation to step in.
So essentially, he's arguing that the U.S. should right a past wrong.
And he even points out that the U.S. did actually recognize Somaliland back in 1960 as an independent state.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
But then, things got messy.
Right.
They thought, hey, this is going to be great. We'll create this, this powerful new Somali nation. But it didn't quite work out the way they planned.
So what happened? Why didn't it work out?
Well, Dowd's argument is that the union, it was supposed to be this voluntary partnership, but it became more like a forced assimilation over time.
Okay.
And so that's where he's saying, hey, the U.S. kind of has a role to play in fixing this.
Makes sense. But why now? What's changed?
That's a great question. And this is where Dowd's kind of realist perspective really comes into play. So he's arguing that recognizing Somaliland right now actually aligns perfectly with U.S. strategic interests.
Oh, interesting. So this goes beyond just a historical or moral obligation.
And some of the potential risks involved. Like what happens if this, encourages a bunch of other separatist movements?
Yeah, that's a valid concern for sure. You don't want to set off a chain reaction of instability.
Exactly. So how does Dowd address that?
Well, he's pretty clear that recognizing Somaliland shouldn't be seen as just like a blanket endorsement of separatism everywhere.
Okay, so it's not just like, hey, every region that's unhappy can just break away.
No, not at all. His argument is that Somaliland's case is unique. It has this strong historical and legal basis for its claim to statehood.
Right, because they were a British protectorate before. Right?
Exactly, for decades, actually. And the union with Somalia, it was brief, and Dowd argues, it was never really fully formalized or accepted by everybody involved. So he's saying the U.S. can actually use this as an opportunity to set a standard.
Oh, okay. What kind of standard?
A standard for other separatist movements in Africa, basically saying, look, if you want to be recognized, here's the bar.
Okay, I like that. So what's the bar?
Well, first of all, you got to show a real commitment to democracy. Human rights, peaceful coexistence with your neighbors, all that good stuff.
Makes sense.
And you need to have, like we were saying, that clear legal and historical basis for your claim.
So you can't just be like, oh, we're unhappy, so we're out of here.
Right. Exactly. There needs to be some substance to it. And Dowd believes that this kind of approach, this standard setting, could actually help to curb separatism in the long run.
That's a really interesting point. Because it's almost like, rewarding good behavior.
Exactly. You're rewarding those groups that are playing by the rules, that are committed to democratic values, and it sort of disincentivizes those who might be tempted to use violence or instability to achieve their goals.
Okay, I see that. So it's like kind of a carrot and stick approach. You're offering recognition as this carrot, but there are also these clear conditions that need to be met.
Yeah, you put it well. And Dowd believes the U.S. is in a unique position to do this, to set that standard.
Because of its history.
Oh, yeah. The U.S. has recognized its fair share of controversial states over the years.
Right. I mean, think about Panama in 1903, Israel in 1948. There's a lot of precedent here.
So he's saying the U.S. has the experience, the diplomatic know-how to navigate these tricky situations.
Exactly. And he thinks they have the credibility to, make this call on Somaliland, even if the AU isn't on board yet. Yeah. I mean, when you think of Africa, you might think big savannas and,
lions and giraffes.
Yeah, exactly. Wildlife.
Right.
But the Horn of Africa is really its own thing.
It really is.
And sort of a global hotspot in many ways.
Yeah, it's a very unique geopolitical situation you have going on there.
Right, and we've seen that increasingly in the news.
Yeah.
Recently you've got Turkey trying to mediate between Ethiopia and Somalia. You've got
That's right.
all these outside powers getting involved.
Absolutely, yeah. The region is sort of at the crossroads of all these different geopolitical trends.
Yeah, so to really understand kind of what's going on, we've zeroed in on Somaliland,
right,
as sort of a
microcosm,
a linchpin,
yeah,
a way to understand why this region is so important to the U.S. and to the world, really.
Yeah, and what's fascinating about Somaliland is it's this sort of unrecognized
right
country.
So the idea here is that the U.S. wants to build stronger ties with Somaliland, but also with Ethiopia and Kenya.
Right.
As a way to counterbalance China.
Exactly.
And to provide these countries with alternatives.
Yeah, it's not just about containing China. It's about providing options to these African countries so they don't have to rely on any one global power too heavily.
Yeah, and that's the key word, I think, right, is options.
Yeah.
Giving these countries choices.
Right, exactly.
In how they develop and who they partner with.
And it's about empowering those countries to make their own choices.
Right, and it's interesting because this whole region, as you said, is at a crossroads.
It is.
And we're seeing these global powers sort of vying for influence.
Yeah.
And Somaliland is right at the heart of that.
Right in the middle of it, yeah.
Are we saying, recognizing them might serve some specific U.S. interests?
Exactly.
Even if, I don't know, it causes a bit of friction on the global stage.
Yeah, there might be some ruffled feathers.
Yeah.
But Mr. Dowd, he actually says the timing of this whole thing is, and I quote, critically opportune.
Interesting.
And that makes me wonder, is this a completely calculated move?
Yeah.
He brings up Ethiopia's recent memorandum of understanding with Somaliland, which, how do you interpret that in this whole situation?
Well, I think it's definitely a key factor. Almost like Ethiopia kind of tested the waters.
Yeah.
With that move. And that makes Somaliland's potential recognition, well, less of a shock.
Right.
on the world stage, I guess.
Exactly.
And this is all happening right after the U.S. pulled troops out of Somalia, right?
Yeah, and that's not a coincidence, I don't think.
Yeah.
I mean, recognizing Somaliland could actually allow the U.S. to keep a presence, some kind of foothold in that region,
Right.
without actually having boots on the ground in Somalia.
Right, strategically.
Exactly.
Speaking of strategy, Mr. Dowd, he really hammers on this idea of Somaliland having, and I quote, exceptional strategic value.
That's a loaded statement.
He even says, just look at the map. So, geographically speaking, what is it that makes this place so strategically important?
Well, I think the first thing to consider is Somaliland's location.
Okay.
I mean, it sits right on the Gulf of Aden.
Uh-huh.
And the source actually argues that this move could lessen the U.S. reliance on those bases in the Gulf.
Okay.
And it would also, potentially help counter Iranian influence in the area.
I see. So it's almost like, I don't know, like diversifying your portfolio.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
Spreading out the strategic assets instead of just having, all your eggs in one basket.
Makes sense.
Thinking about all of this, it seems like this whole debate about Somaliland, it's really about a bigger question in U.S. foreign policy, the tension between idealism and realism.
Absolutely. It's a fundamental question, right? Should the U.S. try to make the world more like it wants it to be? Or should it focus on its own interests, working within the world as it actually is?
It's like choosing between trying to promote democracy and stability through things like intervention and aid, or taking a more practical approach, recognizing that the world is complicated and working with those complications. There's no easy answer.
Definitely not. But when it comes to Somaliland, the sources we looked at today, they make a pretty strong argument that a little bit of realism might be the best way to go. They see it as something that could benefit everyone. More stability, less Chinese influence, maybe even a better future for Somalia.
It's a fascinating case study, and it shows just how much nuance there is in foreign policy. I think what's particularly interesting to me is this idea that Somaliland could be a model for a new way of doing things in Africa, a relationship that's based on partnership, not just aid.
Yeah, that's an important point. And it leads to a question that we can leave our listeners with. What would a more realist U.S. foreign policy actually look like? And how would it affect the world?
It's a big question.
Yeah.
With no simple answers. But it's worth thinking about. And Somaliland gives us a really interesting glimpse into what that might look like. And that's it for our deep dive today. As always, keep those brains working, folks.
haddii aad ilaa dhammaadkii nala joogtay aad baad u mahadsan tahay youtube-kayga hadduuna subscribe ku hayn subscribe saaro saad waxyaabo badan ula socotid hana iloobin like-ta videoga iga qorxi allaha ku sharfee mar kastaba soo dhawow qalbi furan qol furan iyo qaar kalo badan waxyaabo badan oo xiiso leh ayaan idin soo gelin doonaa badteedan channel-kaygan youtube soo dhawow gacmo furan ku soo dhawow